I think we're at the point in our country, but also in the world, where I think we cannot even afford now to just think about our individual stories. I think that has got us into a point where, we're facing destruction, we're facing conflict, we're facing division that has potential terrible, terrible consequences. And unless we actually start thinking more collectively, about our responsibility to each other, but not only to each other, to other life forms, to the planet, and think of that collective story, I think, we're doomed.
Hey, Creating Maven. I'm Joy Spencer, your reframe specialist, with one important message. Your real work, it's not your job or your career. Your real work is what you create. And what you create is what sets you apart and makes you incomparable. It's your legacy. I'm here to show you a whole new way of working so you can create with your gifts, make a unique contribution, and finally get paid to be yourself. This is Reframe to Create.
Picture it. Sicily, 1912. I'm kidding. If you get the reference, you get it. Okay, no, but seriously, I want you to picture it. Picture it. You're about to get into a strategy planning session again. Maybe it's a group of you, or a group of leaders, or you and the rest of your team, but it's probably going to end up like it did last time. A hot mess. But somewhere on the internet, from the thousands of gurus who are out there, you hear that storytelling can be of help here. You've heard that storytelling can help you and your organization, especially when it comes to strategy. Not so fast, I want to caution you. My guest on today's episode has something to say about that. That's going to be a complete reframe for you when it comes to storytelling in and for organizations. My guest today is Brett Davidson, the founder and principal at Wingseed, where he works with foundations and nonprofits around the world who are interested in the power of narrative, storytelling, listening, and creativity for social justice. I mean, can he pack more of my favorite words into a work experience? I think not. He's hit them all. He is also the narrative lead at the International Resource for Impact and Storytelling, which is a donor collaborative for philanthropy, which is focused on strengthening civil society through narrative strategies and creative moving image storytelling for impact. I am like a total fan of all of this and everything that Brett does. So before this conversation with Brett, I was an indiscriminate promoter of individual storytelling in organizations. But Brett has changed my thinking on this to show a better way to leverage storytelling in organizations for strategy and meaning making. And he comes with such wisdom and nuance that I know that you're going to appreciate. We got right into it. So when it comes to storytelling in organizations, and I know this tends to be my focus as a storytelling coach, I tend to focus on the individual and how they can get better with storytelling, using storytelling for connection, influence with their teams. But you have an interesting perspective on that. What is that?
Well, I think individual storytelling is really important. Every person has stories. Every person has stories about themselves that they want to tell, that they might, that they may perhaps deserve to tell, that are very important about why they do their work or whatever it might be. I've coached people in individual storytelling, but that's not enough. And I think, when we live in organizations, we're connected. The organization is not a collection of individuals, whether it, a company, whether a nonprofit, whatever it might be, a movement. It's not just a collection of individuals. It's something more than individuals by themselves. And so we need to think about what is our collective story? What do all of our stories add up to? And what is that collective story? What is the story of the organization itself? What is the story of the movement? What is the story of the company, whatever it might be? And that's something different from just the collection of our individual stories. So, I think this also relates back to, what we're used to in culture, where many or almost most stories are, organized around a single hero who saves the day, who does things, right? And I think that leads us into problems in organizations if all of us are trying to be that individual hero, because then, I think you get into people creating their own little empires. You're getting, people really fighting for their own prominence. And instead of thinking about, well, what is good for the organization? What is the organization story here? So, I've been thinking about strategy as a story, that perhaps our old approaches to strategy and spending months and months and developing a mission and a vision and so on, maybe is no longer relevant because the world is just changing so fast. That by the time you've done all of that and work through a whole process, the whole world is different. So I think, if we actually can get an organizational story clear and say, well, what is the character of this organization? Who are we in the world? And what is our story as an organization? What is our aim? What do we aim to do? What is the context in the setting of our story? What are we trying to achieve? What barriers are we trying to overcome? What challenges are we trying to overcome? And if you get that story clear and say, well, what are our core values? Like, who are we as an organization? What do we hold important? And I don't mean, those kind of platitudes that you often see in people's mission statements, but what really is at the core of why we're here? Then I think you can use that to guide yourself so that, when whatever comes at you, you can then use that to say, well, who are we? What is that North Star that we have? And, what do we need to do in this moment, given our values, given our goals, given our context, to take that next step in this very changing context? So it's a bit, maybe a bit uncertain because you don't necessarily have that long kind of planned out strategy. But I think that's maybe more appropriate for the times we're in. And it helps you then at least take that next step forward and that next step forward.
I like what you've shared, and there's so much in here. And I want to go back to what you said that really blew my mind right from the beginning, that an organization is not just a collection of individuals, because I think that that's an important point and thread to pull that, and I think you've unearthed it. Part of why we're probably having challenges with storytelling in organizations is because everyone's thinking at the individual level, and we think, oh, we just have a whole bunch of them together. It should, emerge into a collective, and it's not going to happen that way because, as you're saying, the collective in the organization is something different than just that collection. And to your point about shifting away from mission vision statements to thinking about story as strategy, I think that's relevant and valuable for the time because, as you said, there's so much ambiguity. There's so much speed that's happening now in the world. Using the old way is sort of always keeping us behind and sort of like late with sort of like coming to the party. So what does it look like when this collective storytelling is happening, organizational storytelling that's different from an individual story, that's different from just a collection of stories of individuals, mosaics, which sort of like will lead to different empires and fiefdoms? What does it look like when it's done well?
Just to get back to this idea of organizations, being more than individuals, it's kind of obvious. If you think about it, people come and go in organizations, and yet an organization continues. Maybe there's a founder whose identity is tied to the organization, but eventually that founder also moves on, and yet the organization continues. So it's kind of obvious, but, I think we've tended to often approach storytelling, as you said, like in this individual way. So I think one way to do it is kind of, have people tell individual stories and then look for, ways that story interconnects. What are the connections between our stories? What are the common themes across our stories? What is the thing that we're all working towards, so that you get people from different maybe areas of work or projects or so on to kind of think about that greater goal that we're working towards, And I think it's just important to keep reminding people of that because, we can get so bogged down in our individual aims, our individual ambitions, or whatever our departments, our projects, or whatever it is, that we lose sight of that. And I think that's when you get things, kind of not really functioning that well, for the overall good. I guess this idea of the kind of collective good, has not been prominent for a while because there's so much emphasis on individualism, and I think maybe also because the nature of work has changed so that, people maybe used to be in an organization for many, many years, whereas now people maybe tend to move on much more quickly and so on. So I think there's that much more of a challenge there, but definitely like, in an organization I worked for before, a prominent funding organization, we always used to think about, so what is it that we do? What are the values that are really, really important behind our work? And that really helped us make decisions, in our case, it was, well, we help fund the people and the issues that are maybe too risky, that other people don't want to fund, but that are really important or too risky in the sense that there may be people who are criminalized, marginalized, and those are the people that we believe should have a voice and we want to, support through our funding. And, keep reminding ourselves of that when it comes to kind of deciding what you do and also what don't you do, what do you not do, which is just as important as deciding what you do.
It sounds like a kind of identity storytelling, like storytelling around our identity, who we are. is very important and powerful for organizations because, as you said, people come and go. But how do I, as a new person coming into this organization, know who I am and who we are as part of the collective? It's through being able to understand not just my individual story, but the story of the organization. And that requires not just coming in and wanting to tell a story, but I think to something that you had pointed out in our previous conversation was this important of, you brought this up and I loved it, story listening, and how important that is to making the shift from the individual view and lens on storytelling to that collective lens. Can you share more about that?
Yeah, well, that's really the idea that, listening is really, really important, and we've kind of neglected it. I think we talk a lot, I work in the field of storytelling, you do as well, and there's just so many incentives for us to speak and tell our own stories, whether it's on, TikTok or Instagram or whatever platform it is. Unless you keep posting, you have to keep posting, keep talking and keep telling your story, or else your listener numbers or your follower numbers or your viewer numbers will go down. Students are evaluated in class and university and schools according to how much they speak up during classes. People in meetings, the most prominent voices get the attention. So there's all this incentive to speak. And yet, we forget about the other side, which is listening. How do we expect others to listen to our stories if we're not willing to listen to theirs?
Yeah.
Often those voices that are drowned out, those people who are maybe more quieter, more introverted, like I am, maybe want to wait before they speak, want to be sure they have something valuable to offer, whatever, don't feel comfortable speaking up in a loud group, but have very important perspectives, or feel maybe they're a minority of some sort and don't feel safe speaking up. But it's really, really important to have those views because they can be vital for an organization to get new ideas, to get new perspectives. And you see so many failures, that happen because you realize people haven't listened. When you have a company that puts out an ad that people realize is racist, and there's a backlash. Now, if they'd listened to maybe, black people in the organization before they did that, they wouldn't maybe have made that mistake. So, and you see that over and over and over again. Or just someone comes from a different background, different discipline, whatever it might be, and has an idea that other people would just not have occurred to other people. So there's such value in creating that space for listening. And also just for, understanding where other people are coming from, how they, as I said, how they might connect to the work, what brought them to the organization, and so on and so forth. I remember one time I worked at a nonprofit in South Africa working to kind of support democracy. And we went on an annual retreat, and we took about a morning, and it was just people sitting around tables in groups. And it was like, tell everyone your story of why you do this work, why you got involved in this work around democracy. And, we'd never done that before. We just always gone straight into strategic planning. But listening to everyone else and why they did the work was really so powerful in helping us, understand where people are coming from, but also creating that collective identity. And so, well, yeah, I came to it for similar reasons. This is what happened to me, and in that case, one thing that stood out for me was how many people had come into that democracy work because of their faith. Because whatever faith they had, they were drawn to work that was going to, advance this idea of democracy and justice. And that was surprising because faith is something that we tend not to want to talk about in work context, right? It's something often that's excluded. And yet it's so powerful. And so just understanding people's motivations, that can get a bond, a sense of sharing. And I think that's really important.
And how did that help change the strategy session or the strategy process? Being able to hear all those values and start to build that collective identity. How do you think it was different, that version versus when you guys had gathered before and just sort of dived into the work?
I think it created much more of a sense of shared purpose. So then it's not only kind of these, maybe arbitrary goals we might set or, that we might kind of want to achieve, but it's like actually we can recognize some common values that we have here, some common motivations across our different stories, common reasons that we're doing this work. So what does that mean for then, what we want to do going forward? So it's not just about what opportunities might exist out in the world. Why are we doing this work in the first place? And if that's disconnected from what opportunities we see immediately, what can we do to change that? What can we do to create opportunities that's more aligned with the values that we have? So I think it maybe can shift the conversation in that way.
Yeah, I can see the importance of raising that awareness because those things were all still true, right? Without the conversation, but how much power was added to the group with the awareness of what was true so that you could actually do something with it. And as you said, find that shared purpose, which is where all the power is when people are moving in alignment towards their goals together, as opposed to things being assumed or not that clear. That's powerful. I like how you're pulling this thread of how we can make our impact stronger, our strategic moves stronger by inviting story listening in, not just, leading into being storytellers, but listening. And I like what you said about listening for common themes and what are the threads and what are the values. You're not just listening to listen and be like, oh yeah, that was nice. Because again, you're not thinking about us as just a collection of individuals. So we're looking intentionally for like, well, how do all these things connect together? Not just to me, but all of us, because there's a reason why we're here. And I think that gives a good roadmap for how organizations or groups or movements can be intentional about using story to support and have sort of like this co-creative strategy that they're developing.
Yeah, and I think I've generally worked, mostly in organizations that are really kind of mission based, so if your aim is just make money and that's it, that might not be that relevant. But if generally, even in a commercial organization, there are often these deeper motivations, right, that people bring to the work, and it's trying to find what that connection is. And I think that's even more important now, because so many people are starting their careers in this era of remote work and Zoom, so it's really difficult to find that connection and understand how you're connected to other people and what that joint purpose is. So I think it's probably even more important right now.
Yeah.
As individuals, it's true as well, but in organizations, I think especially when times get tough and it, can be so difficult to find the funding, find the market, whatever it might be. And so it's often tempting just to go for whatever is available, to go for the thing that it's going to bring me the income. And that might be necessary for a while. But if you do that too much, then you start to lose the sense of why we set this thing up in the first place. Another organization I worked with, we had a strategy meeting and I said, well, why don't we actually just make our strategy that we'll do whatever work someone wants to pay us for, because that's what we're doing, and it's like, let's be real. But that's obviously that's not a strategy. But that's often what you can end up doing because, this looks tempting. This looks like it has a lot of money attached. Let's do this thing. Let's do the other thing. And again, if there are lots of people moving through the organization, you again, it's so easy to lose sense, especially when you've been around for a bit of time and there's been turnover of staff and so on. Like, why are we here in the first place? What are we supposed to be all about? So again, coming back to that collective story, what is our collective story? I think it's really important.
It sounds like this is something that can't be a one-time thing, obviously, because of that cyclical nature of organizations. You have to have it built in and embedded as a process into how your organization lives and exists, so that there's always a renegotiation and a reintroduction to folks about what the collective story is. It can't be this artifact that gets created and put up on a wall somewhere. It has to be interacted with and engaged with as well.
I mean, what often happens probably is that, there's a story of the founder, if it's really kind of founder-centered, or some strongly, big leader, prominent leader in an organization, maybe a person who founded, and then often the story is like that founder and why that person founded the organization, and that's the mythology around it. That can be, can often be the case. But again, that I think only gets you so far if you want to create an organization that people are really committed to and want, and they're not just working there for their own ends, but they're working for something bigger. I think that's limited. Obviously, then you get coalitions and movements, and then it's, again, it's not just one person founding it. And again, it's really important to have that sense of why we're here together. What are we doing together? What is our purpose? So I think in all those circumstances, it's really important to see how you can develop that, as you say, and keep updating that collective story, because it also will change.
So how did you get into this particular work, or how did this sort of question pop up for you? Why is this? Like, what's your story behind wanting to move us towards more individual and collective stories?
I don't know if there's one moment for that, but I've been working on storytelling. Realized I started my work in radio and realized the people who could tell good stories were the people that you wanted to listen to. You would stay listening to. Those people who had expertise but could turn it into an effective story to help you understand complex issues. And so I always knew storytelling was important. And then when I moved into the nonprofit world and the foundation world, really trying to help organizations then and individuals learn how to tell that story so they could communicate what they were doing. Because I think, particularly in the nonprofit world that I've been a part of for so long, we tend to speak in really complicated, obscure jargon, and it can be very difficult for other, outside people to understand what on earth we're actually doing. So I think, again, that was really important to support people in learning how to tell a story that could connect, at a human level with other people. But then, because I work in the world of kind of, I guess, political world of social justice, realizing it cannot just be about individuals. It has to be about more than individuals. It's about all of us. And so, understanding that it's really important then to think about how do we tell those stories that are more collective? And you kind of talked about that's not really how the culture works, certainly not in the United States. It's much more how do we each individually get ahead? But realizing also how, as I said, that leads into problems because there's so many things we can only do with each other.
So how might a leader or a team, start this journey? We've convinced them, right? They're like, okay, I get, the limitations of individual storytelling. I'd like to lean into this collective storytelling. How can I start? What would you say to that person, that leader, that team?
Well, maybe start small, maybe start small with the leadership team first, and have that conversation among a small group of the leadership team. And just maybe, as I said, you could just it could be simple enough to have a session and spend a few hours and take time, because I think it's important to set aside enough time for this, just to go around and talk about the story of why you started, why you work there, why you do this work. It might not even be that organization, but why you do this kind of work. Why do you work in this field? Hear other people's stories and then have a conversation about, what resonated for you and someone else's story. What common themes do we see and so on? What do we see connecting us? And so you start to develop that sense of what might our collective story be. It can be, I think, a bit tricky to do this work in organizations where people maybe feel not safe in sharing their stories and so on. So obviously you have to be careful and not demanding that people tell their story. It doesn't have to be a very personal story, so really making it optional, getting consent and so on, doing the work so that people feel comfortable. Again, so you have to think about all those things. And so it might be that you need to get someone to work with you, experienced facilitator to do that. If it's a case that, it's not going to be that easy. Not everyone doesn't trust each other in this organization and so on. So you might need to start very, make baby steps and also work with someone experienced in dealing with, organizational culture in that way.
No, that's helpful. Setting aside the time, plenty of time to do it. Maybe a leadership team, having someone facilitate the conversation to support them. And the goal is to listen for themes and connections between the stories to unearth what our shared values are and what our collective identity, not just a collection of identities or my individual identity. I like that.
Any entity, like an organization, like a village, like a town, like a country, Benedict Anderson was the person who talked about this idea of imagined communities. We don't know, in a small company, yes, but other than that, we don't know or meet everyone who's a part of our community. It's impossible. And so we have this imagined idea of who they are, right? And who's included and who's excluded and so on. And there's a collective, maybe unspoken story there, some assumption about, who our community is, who our organization is, who belongs to it, who doesn't, what kind of people are in, what kind of people are out. And again, so it can be actually important again to actually try and make that explicit and think about that and say, we've excluded this group of people unthinkingly, or, we never hear from that group of people. We've assumed it's this kind of people. Maybe we need to expand that to include others, So I think that kind of process and conversation is really, really important.
I like this. I think you've given us a roadmap for how to make that shift from individual to collective storytelling and making it something valuable and useful that a group can use for their co-creative strategy, using story as strategy, using story listening as a mechanism to unearth that shared collective identity that they can take to move them forward.
Yeah, totally. Exactly. I think we're at the point in the world and in our country, but also in the world where I think we cannot even afford now to just think about our individual stories. I think that has got us into a point where, we're facing destruction, we're facing conflict, we're facing division that is potentially, has potential terrible, terrible consequences. And unless we actually start thinking more collectively, about our responsibility to each other, but not only to each other, to other life forms, to the planet, and think of that collective story. I think, we're doomed to put it, plainly, and I think we really have to regenerate this idea of the collective, that yes, we're individuals, but we're responsible to one another. We're responsible to the planet. We depend on the planet. The planet depends on us. We can't survive and exist without each other, and I think so. It's not just a nice thing to do. It's not just something that's going to help an organization survive. I think we have to do it for our own sake, for our own futures and for our children's future.
It's essentially getting us back to reality, because the reality is, as you said, we're a collective, we're interdependent, and we've been telling stories and acting as if we were not. And it's time to get back to reality. What else do you want to share with the listener?
I'll share one more thing, which is thinking about this idea of listening, or maybe, listening to develop a collective story, but the idea of listening to one another as being really important. Often that is also thought about individually, right? We need to individually learn to listen to others and develop that skill of listening, which is absolutely very important. I can do with that training, can do with improving my own listening for sure. But again, thinking about it organizationally or systemically or structurally, I think it's really important to think, how do we enable that? How do we create the infrastructure for that listening to happen? It's not just about us individually developing the capacity to listen to other stories, right? We have to create the incentives, the opportunities to do that. In society, our social media platforms use algorithms to divide us into these very kind of narrow niches of people, narrow interests, which is dividing us and disconnecting us from each other, So we need a new infrastructure that's going to be able to bring us together across different interests, across different backgrounds. There used to be like the town square, right, where people used to meet and come together. Now, in many cities, they're designed around cars. So aside from maybe a shopping mall or something, there's no place for people to come together and do that and encounter one another, and kind of meet people and have to jostle with people who are different from them, and kind of talk and work together. So, we have fewer and fewer of those opportunities and spaces, but we need to create more of them in organizations as well. Think about how the workplace is designed. Are there occasions and opportunities for people to like meet in an elevator or a kitchen or a lounge or something, so that actually you can come together and talk together, because that's also part of creating that shared story, and so often there aren't those spaces. And particularly now with our Zoom calls, we don't even have a shared office, right? There's no place to kind of say, hey, come have a coffee and let's talk about something together. So how do we actually even set up meetings maybe with no particular agenda and just to kind of chat and connect? I think thinking about those things, or is there an opportunity for us to come together in physical space once or twice a year or something, so it's not just up to individuals. We have to think about, how do we create that infrastructure and the systems that enable us to do that. That's really important too.
This was legit, and I am so glad that Brett was my first guest to kick us off after I announced in episode 117 my intention to expand our conversation here at Reframe to create from me to we, from what's been our more individually focused lens up until this point to intentionally expanding the aperture to look at how reframing together, and as a result, creating together, can be the key to more of the beautiful impact we want to have in this world. I think Brett was the right person to kick us off in that conversation. So this has been about moving us from not just you or me as separate individuals, off in our corners, but to us together. And starting with that view of not just individual storytelling, but collective storytelling. Brett has helped us to bridge many important gaps, with these reframes. First, he's unearthed what might be the hang-up you're seeing on your team or in your organization when it comes to building your strategy, which is your individual stories, and a focus on individual storytelling may be creating silos and getting in the way of a collective understanding of your team story or your organization story. Of course, individual stories have their place, but what we talked about today is the limits of individual storytelling. So Brett helped us to reframe in 3 important ways. 1, shifting from the individual hero's journey story of storytelling to collective identity stories for our whole team or our whole organization. He showed us the need to go from me stories to we stories. Then 2, shifting from mere storytelling to story listening, especially when we're looking for a collective identity from our collective stories. Members of the team need to learn how to lean into story listening. It's the key to discovering the connecting themes and connective tissue values that make up the collective identity. And for that, we need to not just train ourselves to be better individual listeners, but seed collective listening into the infrastructure of our organizations. Without this ability to draw themes, trends, and make sense of the collective story, you're still just left with many individual disjointed stories that won't help you move forward together. And moving forward together is what you're trying to do when you gather for these strategy and planning meetings, right? Right. So that's why, number 3, the overall shift in our thinking needs to be from these static mission and vision statements and these static strategy planning work in favor of the dynamism that is story as strategy. Brett has helped us expand our worldview here at Reframe to Create. Yes, we still need to always be doing the work of knowing and creating with our individual gifts and telling powerful stories about them, but there is more. There is who we are in community, who we are with others, the stories we are a part of together, and the things we create together. And Brett is showing us a way to get started on this journey. I'm going to continue in this work and continue this conversation with Brett where I always find him, and I invite you to do the same. I've included how you can find out more about his work as the founder of Wingseed, where he can help you or your organization unlock the power of story to spark change, deepen connection, and move ideas into action. I also have how you can connect with and follow him on LinkedIn. You can find all of that in the show notes. I want to remind you of the assignment Brett shared so that you can start pulling this into practice. The next time your team or your leadership team gathers, take on a collective story gathering exercise by having everyone go around the room to answer this question. What's the story behind why you are here and why you care about this work? And then listen together. Your collective goal in this conversation is to listen. Specifically to listen for themes and connections and see what comes into view about the character and values of the collective whole. Because without that collective identity, that collective story, that collective reframe, you're not creating anything good together anytime soon. And I know that creating beauty together is what you want. So next time you gather, try out this exercise. See you soon, Creating Maven. Until then, remember to ask, what will we create?